resistance, whether used appropriately or inappropriately. Antibacterial use, antibacterials, whether used appropriately or inappropriately, is a primary level of antibacterial resistance. Community-acquired infections such as acute respiratory tract infections and diarrhea are a leading cause of mortality and morbidity in under 5s in low and middle income countries. High and inappropriate use of antibacterials have been reported in children who suffer from these conditions, and the method of self-reports that is often used to study antibacterial use has been reported to have a low validity. In this study, we assessed antibacterial use. We developed an LC-MS-MS method and assessed the validity of self-reports in northern Uganda. The reason why we studied northern Uganda is because northern Uganda suffered over 2 decades of war, which affected the health sector. And we find that effective health service delivery is lacking in this area, especially in the management of children under 5 with community-acquired infections. So the problem is that there is high and inappropriate antibacterial use in under 5s, and self-reports that is often used to study antibacterial use has been reported to have no validity. And there is no data on antibacterial use and accuracy of self-reports in post-conflict, low-middle income countries. And then also there is no available reference standard or gold standard that can be used to assess accuracy of self-reports. The available methods have a limited sensitivity, and then they use like HPLC UV for detection, and then they also detect few antibacterials. And this is not cost effective and time consuming. Hence the need for a method for multiple detection of antibacterials. So in this thesis, we answered the following research questions. What is the prevalence of antibacterial use in children under 5 reported to have had acute respiratory tract infections and or diarrhea? What factors are associated with antibacterial use among these under 5s? And is it possible to develop an LC-MS-MS method for simultaneous identification of multiple antibacterials that are commonly used in under 5s from dry urine samples and dry blood samples? Are self-reports on antibacterial use in under 5s comparable to laboratory results? The main objective was to investigate antibacterial use and develop methods for getting better information on previous antibacterial intake in road settings. Specifically, we had to determine the prevalence of antibacterial use among under 5s reported to have had acute respiratory tract infections and or diarrhea, to determine factors associated with antibacterial use among these under 5s, to develop a LCMS method for simultaneous detection of multiple antibacterials from dry urine samples and dry blood samples, and to determine the validity of caregiver reports on prior antibacterial use in under 5s. As a justification for this study, Uganda has adopted a national action plan to control the spread and emergence of antimicrobial resistance. And as one of the key priority interventions is to optimize antibacterial use. As a prerequisite, it is important to monitor how antibacterials are used. However, this is not often done in children under 5, and the method of self-report that is used have been shown to have low validity. Another rationale for this study is that we have a high out-of-pocket expenditure on healthcare in Uganda, estimated to be around 41%, and this encourages over-the-counter use of antibacterials to inappropriate use. So this is a relationship between the 3 sub-studies. In sub-study 1, we investigated the prevalence and factors associated with antibacterial use in under 5s. And as part of the results, we identified commonly used antibacterials. And in sub-study 2, we developed and validated an LCMS method for identification of these commonly used antibacterials. Then the sub-study 2 acted as a gold standard in assessment of validity of self-reports. So in sub-study 1, where we assess the prevalence and factors associated with antibacterial use, the study was a cross-sectional study which was carried out among under 5s by interviewing the caregivers. These are under 5s who were reported to have had ARIs and odd diarrhea in the 2 weeks before data collection. The study was carried out in Bulo district, and Bulo is about 360 kilometers from Kampala. As of 2016, the population was estimated to be 2,075, 613 people, and the main economic activity of the people in the area, of 90% of the people in the area, is subsistence agriculture. We included the children under 5 reported to have had acute respiratory tract infection and odd diarrhea in the previous 2 weeks. And we excluded children whose caregivers were not home during the survey. Our sample size was 853, and this was computed using Kish-Leslie formula for estimation of a single proportion. We adjusted for clustering using a design effect of 2 and non-response rate of 10%. It was a multi-state sampling where villages were sampled using proportional probability proportional to size ratio, and households were randomly selected. Data was carried, we collected data using household surveys, and we interviewed caregivers of the children. It was an interviewer administered questionnaire interview. As you observe here, this is a data collector interviewing a caregiver. Statistical analysis for continuous variables with calculated means and standard deviations. For prevalence, we use clustered, robust standard errors since we are doing cluster sampling. And also to account for clustering, we used random effects logistic regression for both univariable and multivariable analysis. In sub-study 2, which was a laboratory experiment was carried out in Kigali, that is the Directorate of Government Analytical Laboratory, Bandigia. And this method was a new method which we developed from scratch. The reference substances and Watman filter paper were donated by Karolinska Institute University Hospital, Budinga. And then the LCMS grade acetonitrile, methanol, water formic acid, and ammonia formate were provided from Kigali. Then whole blood and urine samples were obtained from volunteers. This method was validated for false negative, false positive, selectivity, sensitivity, and reliability. Given that it is a qualitative method, its validation is different from the validation of a quantitative method. The method was later on applied on healthy adult volunteers who had not taken antibacterials for at least a month, and we excluded those who are not available during the time of sample collection, exact time of sample collection. 9 adults volunteered to participate in the study. However, we excluded 3, and the sampling was purposive. So each volunteer was given a single dose of a combination of 3 antibacterials. As you can see that there are 6 volunteers. The first volunteer got azithromycin, penicillin V, and amoxicillin. Second volunteer was given ampicillin, tetracycline, and metronidazole. The third was given clarithromycin, cephalexin, cotrimoxazole. The fourth got chloramphenicol, cipro, and proxaxilin. The fifth was given amoxicillin, ampicillin, and erythromycin. Then the last one got chloramphenicol, penicillin V, and penicillin G. These combinations were chosen to mimic what happened in the community, not based on pharmacology. We wanted to do what the people in the community practice. So we collected dry blood samples and dry urine samples from these volunteers on filter paper before intake to ensure that they did not have any antibacterials in that system. Then 1 hour and 3 hours after intake, and these hours were chosen based on the pharmacokinetics of the medicines. And then we extracted and analyzed the samples using the LCMS method, which we have developed. In sub-study 3, it was a processional study, which was still carried out in Gulu, in 4 health centers. And by the time of the study, Gulu had a total of 4 hospitals, 19 health center 2s, 10 health center 3s, 1 health center 4, 31 registered pharmacies, and 135 licensed drug shops. We studied, this study was carried out among caregivers of under 5s who were brought to the hospital, and also the children themselves, as you can observe here, the caregiver and the child. We included children, 6 children under 5 who were brought to the health facility, and excluded those who were not brought by the caregivers, and also the critically ill children. A population of 385, sample size of 385 was computed using cashless formula for estimation of a single proportion. And then sampling criteria, we purposely selected 4 health centers because they serve the greatest need of the community. And then the patients were sampled using systematic random sampling. Data collection was through interviewer administered questionnaires, as you can observe in the picture. A data collector is interviewing the caregiver. Then later on, we collected dry blood and dry urine samples from the under 5. As you can observe, the dry blood samples being have been collected on the filter paper and are drying. And then we calculated median and interquartile range for continuous variables. Then to assess association, we use the Pearson's chi-square test. Then to assess for validity of self-reports, we calculated sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value, prevalence, agreement, and alignment. So here is a summary of the methods. Substudy one. Wait here, guys. Substudy one was a cross-sectional study where we carried out a household survey and interviewed the caregivers of under 5. We carried out the study among under 5 who are reported to have had symptoms of acute respiratory tract infection and old diarrhea, and calculated a sample size of 85 data was collected using questionnaires, and we calculated means and standard deviations for continuous variables, and then we used random effects logistics regression to assess for univariable and multivariable analysis. Then in substudy 2 was a variable-based experiment where we developed a method, LCMS method, and this method was applied on healthy volunteers, where 9 were recruited and 3 were excluded. We assessed for false, validated for false negative, false positive, selectivity, sensitivity, and reliability. Then in substudy 3, it was a cross-sectional study where red blood spots and gray urine spots were collected from children under 5 and analyzed using LCMS method. Our sample size was 385, and the study was carried out among caregiver children there. We used questionnaires. Then we assessed for median and interquartile range. Association was assessed using Pearson's chi-square test, and then validity was assessed using sensitivity, positive predictive value, specificity, and negative predictive value, agreement, and kappa coefficient. So our results for substudy 1, we sampled 911 participants. Majority of the children were male, and most of them were from rural areas, with majority of the caregivers being female and had no education. And then most of them were peasants, and 318 of the children had diarrhea, and 856 had acute respiratory tract infection. The mean age of the children was 25.4 months with standard deviation of 0.5, and then that of the adults was 29 with SD of 0.3. So according to our assessment, the prevalence of antibacterial use in the RIs was 60.2%, and then the prevalence in the area was 52%. And this high prevalence would be attributed to how readily people access and can afford antibiotics. And this can not only be due to prescription, but they can also get it over the counter. And this could be due to inadequate enforcement of the regulation. According to the National Drug Policy, antibiotics are supposed to be prescription-only medications. But because of inadequate enforcement of this regulation, you find that people can easily access antibiotics over the counter. And then also the non-functional laboratories, where most treatment is just based on presumptive diagnosis. And all this is a potential driver of emergence of and spread of resistance. In our findings, of ARIs, it is similar to other studies which have also been done in low and middle income countries. A study in Indonesia, which assessed both self-medication and also prescription use of antibiotics, reported a lower prevalence of 49.3%. Another study in Kampala, which studied self-reported use of antibiotics, reported a low prevalence of 43%. Then the findings of diarrhea is also similar to other studies that have been done in low and middle income countries. A study in India reported a higher prevalence of 77.9. All this can lead to antibacterial resistance and antibacterial associated diarrhea. So the factors that were associated with antibacterial use in ARIs was mainly those children who were reported to have come from peri-urban areas, and also people who got treatment from the health facilities. Then, as you can notice there, the p-value of children who had cough is actually lower than that of children who had fast breathing. And yet it's supposed to be the other way around, where fast breathing was supposed to have a lower prevalence, because fast breathing is considered as a symptom of pneumonia. And then in diarrhea, still those children from peri-urban areas and children who had both diarrhea with ARIs were noted, had a lower p-value, and also children who got treatment from health facilities were receiving antibacterials compared to those who were not taking health facilities. Now, what was surprising is that children who had bladder diarrhea with ARIs, where it was not significant for them, and yet antibacterials are recommended in bladder diarrhea. So in a discussion bit for children from health who receive treatment from healthcare facilities, the finding is also similar to those from other low and middle income countries. And this could be because of non-factual laboratories where treatment is based on presumptive diagnosis. And then also another explanation would be because of high prevalence of infectious diseases. And then also poor access to healthcare facilities, such that by the time the patients reach the healthcare facilities, they will be in a worse state of needing antibacterials. Studies have also reported that health workers that have a high level of education rarely misuse antibacterials. And yet we find that this study was done in the rural communities where most of the healthcare workers have a lower education level. So that could also be an explanation for high use of antibacterials for those who was that. And from those in urban areas, usually the population is enlightened, wealthy, and have better access to healthcare facilities. And then we also noticed that the difference, fast breathing, although the p-value was not really significant, but fast breathing is considered as a symptom of pneumonia and antibacterial is recommended. Cough had a lower p-value than fast breathing, and this indicates something that probably these healthcare workers don't take serious medical examination, and when you have cough, they just give you antibacterial, and yet it was supposed to be the other way around. Then diarrhea, we noted those children who had diarrhea and with ARI were being given antibacterials. And studies have shown, just like our finding, that probably this antibacterial may have been given to these children to treat the ARIs. As a limitation of this study, we simply ask the caregivers that for the symptom that your child had, what medicine did you give? We didn't ask them whether they were giving the medicine for diarrhea or for ARIs. We simply concerned with the symptom. And we have also noted that blood diarrhea is not significant, which is a sign of inappropriate use because antibacterials are supposed to be given in patients who have blood diarrhea. So like we reported that part of our finding in sub-study 1 was to get the most commonly used antibacterials for which we developed a method in sub-study 2. So as we can observe here, there's self-medication and health facility use. So the most commonly used antibacterials are amoxicillin, ampicillin, ampicillin plus fluoxetine, which is ampiclox, azithromycin, chloramphenicol, ciprofloxacin, erythromycin, gentamicin, cotrimoxazole, metronidazole, tetracycline, cephalexin, and others. And others, that is clarithromycin. So in some studies too, we developed a method, and this is a chromatogram showing the 15 antibacterials. And on our right, we have the key, which shows the retention time of the different antibacterials. You will notice that chloramphenicol, which is here, has the same color as fluoxetine, which is around here. So this can all be seen based on the retention time. This same method was validated, and all the medicines were within the acceptable range, where the false negative rate was supposed to be less than or equal to 7%, false positive rate should be 0%, reliability should be greater than or equal to 93%, selectivity should be 100%, and sensitivity should be greater or equal to 93%. And then the healthy volunteers analyzed the absent before intake. Like I told you, we took blood before intake, 1 hour after, and then 3 hours after. Then after 1 hour, all the drugs were present except azithromycin and clarithromycin. And this could be because this medicine takes some time. Azithromycin takes about 2 hours and 45 minutes to reach peak plasma level, while clarithromycin takes about 3 hours to reach. And then after 3 hours, then B was not detectable in TBS and TUS, and this could be attributed to its pharmacokinetics. So in sub-study 3, we recruited and analyzed the results of 355 children under 5. Over half of them were female. The median age was 29, and then majority of the caregivers were female, and the median age of the caregivers was 25 years. Half of the children attended healthcare facilities located in rural areas. So our results are 51 people, children were reported to have taken antibiotics before coming to the healthcare facility. However, when we analyze the dry blood and dry urine samples, we found that 226 had antibacterials either in blood or urine or in both. Then of the 51 who reported that they had given that were given antibacterials, 39 had antibacterials in their blood, 12 did not have. Then of the 304 who reported not having given antibacterials, only 117 did not have, meaning they were underreporting. Because if 304 said they did not, and you find that only 117 did not have, means there's something somewhere underreporting. And then the selectivity was 17.3. Selectivity is basically this 39 people. The proportion of those who had antibacterials in their samples and reported that they had. So it is the 39 out of 226. Then the specificity is the number of those who say they, is the proportion of those who had no antibacterials in their system and had reported not having taken. So it is this 117 out of the 129. Then the positive predictive value is the proportion of those who reported not having, having given antibacterials and still had it. So it is the 39/51. And then the negative predictive value is the proportion of those who say they did not take and still do not have it in the system, which is the 117/14. So it is this one, and it is a sign of underreporting. So the prevalence is the proportion of children who had taken antibacterials, in that system, which is the 226/355. Then the FG stands for agreement, which is trying to show us the concordance, the similarity between self-report and what is in the blood. So the agreement, the two agree at 43.9%. However, this agreement can also be due to chance. So the best way to see the agreement was to calculate the kappa coefficient, which is step, which was 0.06, and this is slightly poor. Then the likelihood ratio was 1.9. Likelihood ratio is the probability of those who reported having taken antibacterials and still had positive results to those who reported not having taken antibacterials but still had positive results. Then the likelihood ratio of a negative test is the proportion of those who reported having taken antibacterials but had negative results to the probability of those who reported not having taken antibacterials and had negative results. So we'll see that in our samples, it was 63.7% who had taken antibacterials, but those who reported was 14.4%. So this finding is similar to studies done in other countries, and a study carried out in Ghana reported self-reported use to lab visit was 19.9, but when the urine samples were analyzed, they found out that 31.4% had antibacterials in the urine. So this can be explained with the fact that self-medication is a common practice in Uganda. The negative predictive value, as we explained earlier on, indicates underreporting, and this could be because of the low adult literacy levels in these communities, and also social desirability bias. Probably these people thought if they said the truth, maybe they will be treated differently in the health facility. But we try to minimize this by isolating ourselves from the health workers. And also probably these children were exposed to antibacterials through the food chain, like the use of veterinary use of antibacterials, maybe in milk, probably in water, and also the low quality of antibacterials in the market would also be responsible for this what we call underreporting. And as a result of this, because of underreporting, it can lead to duplication of therapy where you're given the same medicine that you've been taking at home and did not work. Then also incorrect management of the child, and then also failure to appreciate non-compliance and inaccurate research conclusions. In conclusion, our conclusion is based on our objectives. So from the first objective, the prevalence of antibacterial use among undertypes was high. And then the determinants of antibacterial use in both diarrhea and ARIs included getting treatment from health facility and then households that were located in urban areas. Then for those who had ARIs, having hope and fast breathing were also significant, and then having diarrhea with ARIs. And the developed qualitative LCM method can be used to detect 15 commonly used antibacterials in dry blood samples and dry urine samples in patients. And then the validity of caregivers' reports on intake of antibacterials by their children prior to health facility visit was low. Then recommendation, there is need for targeted education on appropriate antibacterial use among healthcare workers and caregivers. And then also researchers should consider using the developed qualitative LCMS method. And then there is need to educate caregivers about the risks of self-medication and advantages of reporting prior use of antibacterials. Policy implications, there is need for antimicrobial stewardship programs targeting health workers and caregivers, especially in peri-urban areas. The caregivers' performance can be improved by in-service training, and then caregivers in peri-urban areas can be sensitized using radios, TVs, and newspapers. Then there is also need for regulatory bodies to enforce prescription use of antibacterials. And where possible, there is need for electronic pharmacy dispensing files, which can be shared among prescribers. Then for future studies, there is need to assess factors associated with underreporting of antibacterial use. We couldn't assess this because of lack of finances and time, and we didn't know when we were going to the field that people were underreporting. So there is need to go back and find out why, what factors are associated with that. Then also there is need to quantify and report the levels of antibacterials in biological fluids. We didn't study this because it was not part of our objective. Our objective was to screen, which was basically qualitative. But because some of these children may have been exposed to these antibacterials from the food chain, it is important to know the levels so that we know where there is underreporting and where it is from the food chain. Then factors associated with antibacterial overuse and misuse among health workers and caregivers from urban areas needs to be studied. Then there is also a need for intervention studies in relation to more responsible use of antibacterials. And then there is need for further research to determine the generalizability of these findings, because this study was basically confined in one district. So this study was approved by Makerere University School of Biomedical Sciences Research and Ethics Committee, Uganda National Council of Science and Technology. Then we also got permission from the district authorities, village authorities, health facility authorities, and then the laboratory authorities. Written informed consent was obtained from caregivers of under 5s and the health volunteers. So in this, we managed to publish 4 papers. One was use of antibacterials in the management of symptoms of acute respiratory tract infections among children under 5 years in Gulu, northern Uganda. We looked at the prevalence and determinants. Then the second paper was on antibiotic use among children under 5 years with diarrhea in rural communities of Gulu, northern Uganda, a cross-sectional study. The third paper was a qualitative LCMS method for simultaneous screening of 15 common to use antibiotics from dry blood and dry uric spots. The fourth paper was on the validity of caregiver reports on prior use of antibacterials in children under 5 years presenting to health facilities in Gulu, northern Uganda. I would like to thank CEDA for funding this study. The PIs of the project, Professor Cecilia Skalberg from Sweden and Professor Celestino Ogua from Mbarara University. I'd also like to thank Professor Windsor for coordinating the entire CEDA Makerere project. I'd like to appreciate the support of my supervisors, mentors, and members of the doctoral committee. And then also, I would like to thank my colleagues from KI, the KI research team. I appreciate the support I got from Karolinska Institute Hospital, Kudiga. Thank all my colleagues from Project 346 for all the support, the moral support that we have been giving each other, the guidance. Then the coordinators of the Project 346, Associate Professor Joan Kaliambo and Dr. Moses Ochan. I thank all my colleagues from pharmacology for understanding and giving me the work as I was doing my study. Then the research assistants and chemists from the Directorate of Government Analytical Laboratory, my family and friends, and the Almighty God. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lanyero, for the presentation. Indeed, in a special way, let's recognize the team from Karolinska, the online. Professor Jaran Eriksson, can you hear us? Thank you for supporting our student, both as a mentor and maybe financial. We appreciate. I will now give the floor to our opponent. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much, Hindum Lanyero, for presenting your research findings as in defense of your PhD thesis. My name is Amon from Mbarara University of Science and Technology, Department of Pharmacology and Therapeutics, and I'm here as a son examiner, what is called the opponent in the language of Makerere University. I don't know what opponent is, opposition or opposing. I'm not really sure. Yeah, but in any case, I received Hindum Lanyero's dissertation for, thesis for examination. And he made recommendations depending on research questions and research findings in the view of the format in which she presented her work, and writing style. But I thought there were some gaps which we have addressed. I forwarded this to the Dean of Biomedical Sciences with an evaluation of what I thought was her performance. So in this regard, I want to thank the Dean of Biomedical Sciences for inviting me to examine and to work. and also the Department of Pharmacology, the head of the department for nominating me. Thank you so much. I appreciate the work done by the supervisors, members of the doctoral committee, as well as the funders. So, Dr. Lanyero, already a doctor of dental surgery? Yes. So I'm going to take you some aspects of your research as well as the write-up, your cases. Number one, I'd like to know questions one at a time, and I will give you time to answer a few questions at a time. And some are going to be comments from what I've observed. Number one is, what was your motivation to carry out this work? Before you start any research project, research work, there is a motivation, of course, based on your career growth and your interest, the field of study. Because I see you evolving from a dental surgeon, a pharmacologist, public health pharmacologist. So what was your motivation for doing this work?
The reason why I decided to study antibacterial use in children under 5 is because of the alarming cases of resistance, which is a worldwide problem. It's a big problem currently in the world. People are misusing antibiotics and something needs to be done about it. So I was motivated to go and find out how these antibiotics are being used in the rural communities, because most research, especially in the post-conflict area, most research is being done, but is a neglected area. So I thought I should go and find out in this post-conflict area, how are people using these antibiotics?
Okay. So can you project your title? Slide number 1. Yeah, monitoring antibacterial use in children under 5 in rural communities of northern Uganda. So number one, why among all possible medicines you could have studied, why did you consider studying antibacterials?
I considered studying antibacterials because antibacterials are among the most commonly used medicines compared to other medicines. And also they are readily accessible over the counter, much as the prescription on medicine. So, and because also the alarming levels of resistance, like I said before, especially of antibiotics. Yeah, that's why I decided to study antibiotics.
There could have been triggers in that community that made you think of antibiotics. Don't you think? Whether reports published in the literature or Ministry of Health reports, which really indicated why antibiotics among other drugs are being used in that area.
Yes, previous research has been done in northern Uganda, especially on self-medication. And it was reported that antibiotics were was actually the most commonly drug that people self-medicate with.
Okay, probably we'll get it clear. Why under 5? Children under 5. that will drive us to the essence of the research. Why children under 5?
Children under 5 suffer the most from community-acquired infection. So that's why I decided to study them.
And in your write-up, you have evidence to this, you have published data, isn't it?
Yes.
You have citations, that point.
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. Are in rural communities?
The reason why we decided to study people in the rural communities is because of access to health, access to health care in these communities. And also in rural communities, we find that most of the people who provide health care are the village health teams, and these people are not, they have a lower level of education and are most likely to misuse antibiotics as reported.
Okay. And you hinted in your presentation why you considered Gulu in northern Uganda. Which specific area of Gulu? I believe it was not the whole district.
Yeah, we studied 6 counties, which was Awach, Paito, Rongatira, Oyama, Laro, and Batege.
Yeah, I would have preferred you were able to see how you pinpointed those specific areas among the others. Was there a specific method you used to arrive at that particular area? Or what were the pointers? Let's say we use this particular area for this research among the others. Is there a specific method you used to choose that particular area? Selection of the study site. How did you do it? Is it just random? Or you were guided?
No, we decided to choose area which were representative of both low population, to represent both low and high population areas. That's how we arrived at that.
Right. Okay, as we go along, I think we shall clarify some of the aspects as indicated in your title, because this is the essence of your work. You can dissect your work by just understanding the title in detail. So you did 3 sub-studies. In your own words, without going through to the slides, what did you do in sub-study 1?
In sub-study 1, I assessed the prevalence and main factors associated with antibacterial use in children under 5. Yeah, and from there, we managed to get out the commonly used antibacterials, yes, which we use to develop a method for in sub-study 2.
Because there were underlying problems in children under 5. Isn't it? What were these underlying problems?
Children under 5 commonly suffer from community-acquired infections, such as acute respiratory tract infection and diarrhea. And yet, these infections are usually viral, but we find that in most cases, people treat them with antibacterial.
What did you do in sub-study 2?
In sub-study 2, we developed an LC-MSMS method for detection of 15 commonly used antibacterials in dry urine and dry blood spots. These antibacterials were the ones we got from study one. Yeah.
What was the end point of that particular study?
The end point is that the method was fully validated, and when we applied it on some health volunteers, we were able to detect these antibacterials in these healthy volunteers, and then we used that sub-study as a whole standard to assess the accuracy of sub-study.
So in your presentation and in the book, you indicate that you developed this new method, liquid chromatography tandem MS spectrometry method. So can you take us through the steps through which you developed this method? For each method, there is a process by which it is developed,
So
the stage where it is applied. So take us through the steps through which you developed this, this method.
the first step was to develop the optimize the chromatographic conditions, which included getting the appropriate mobile phase, getting the appropriate column to be used, and then also getting the appropriate pH, which we could use, and the appropriate voltage. And then we also had to develop the appropriate method for extraction to get the best extraction solvent to be used. Yeah. Then we recruited after developing the method and ensuring that it can work. We recruited healthy volunteers whom we gave we gave combinations of antibacterials to take. Then afterwards, we got dry blood and dry urine samples from them, which we analyzed using our developed method.
Yeah, while assessing your work, I found this a very, very important aspect of your work. Having developed a new method, something to be novel in your work, this should be a very big achievement. But most methods, if you're able to develop them, usually there is a lead. So for the lead, either you look at previous methods, modify them, you optimize them, you validate them based on what you want to do. So where was this work done? Where was the method done? In which laboratory? In which setting?
At the Directorate of Government Analytical Laboratory in Rwanda.
Okay. So take us through the processes from either there was a previous method that you decided to modify, or you went straight and said, we are going to devise a new method for doing this work, a new method for analyzing these blood samples. So there was no hint. This is something that came to your mind. You say, I'm developing a new method.
We developed a new method from scratch.
So take us through the
Also,
steps.
we read some papers which were developed before. Yeah, but this method here we developed it from scratch.
So what was the first step? First, you got hints from literature, previous methods that have been similar methods.
Yeah.
Analyze bioassay. Let's say antibiotics in blood and urine, isn't it?
Yeah.
So can you tell us other methods similar to what you did that would have been used?
Of course, other methods. There's a method where trimethoprim and and sulfamethoxazole was quantified from dry plasma and dry urine spot. And then there's also another method where metronidazole was quantified in prenatal children. Yeah. So looking at those methods and the mobile phases they use and the columns, we got ideas on that. Yeah.
So that was the first step. You got an idea. So what was the next step?
So the next step was to try and apply the conditions that were used. Of course, after making our dry blood and dry urine spots, we tried to use the conditions that were used in those studies to try and extract the analytes. Yes, then we prepared our stock solution from which we prepared standard or working solutions from. Yeah, then after that, yes, I think after that after extracting, preparing our standard solution, we decided to run the method.
So I would suggest that in your write-up, due diligence is done to refer to the site where you got the ideas developing that method, because it's not evident in your write-up. You say you developed a method, but now you are saying you got hints from previous methods. So I would suggest you include your hints, that methodology, they are included in the chapter on method development. And then you indicate briefly the steps that were taken
We got what?
You can project on the methodology, sub-study 3, what you did.
Yeah, in sub-study 3, we assess the validity of self-reports. And in doing this, we asked caregivers of children under 5 whether they are given medicine to the children before bringing them to the health facility. Then we went ahead and got samples, blood and urine samples, filter paper. Then we analyzed these the blood and urine samples using the method developed in that study too. Then we compared what the self-report and what we found out in the sample.
Okay. So having taken up the studies that were done, so what is the problem that you are addressing in this research? What is the problem you are addressing?
The problem is inappropriate use of medicine has been reported in children under 5 who suffer the most from community-acquired infection. However, the method of self-report that is normally used to assess these studies have been shown to have a low validity. So we decided to, and there is no available data on antibacterial use and accuracy of self-reports in rural communities of post-conflict northern Uganda. So we decided to assess the use of antibacterials and also assess the validity of self-reports. And then we also observed that there is no available method that we could use as a gold standard in assessing self-reports. So we decided, and most of the available methods have either limited sensitivity or the methods test 1 or 2 antibacterials, and this is a bit costly and time consuming. So we decided to develop a method that we could use to assess quality of self-report.
Yeah, I agree with you. Inappropriate antibacterial use is an issue, and it is a consequence of the factors that you alluded to. But if this inappropriate antibacterial use is not dealt with, it's not acted upon, what is the consequence? What will be the problem?
There will be emergence and spread of resistance.
Yes, the drug resistance, what else?
It could lead to also poor clinical outcome in patients. And then it could also lead to wastage of resources, financial resources.
So we find out the current status of monitoring of antibacterial use, the general setting of the Ministry of Health as a basis for developing the hypothesis for your research. Did you find out from the literature the current status of monitoring? Because you are monitoring, your study is monitoring in that particular area. But did you bring the baseline, current status of monitoring antibacterial use overall? Ministry of Health. I suggest maybe in your literature review, the current status of monitoring, because that is the basis of your work, I believe. The literature review should have the current status of monitoring, so that you can derive logical conclusions. I studied, I did this work. This was the status of monitoring of antibacterial use in the Ministry of Health. This is what I found out. This is what I'm making recommendations, but you are missing in the concept development, which I think you can add. Literature review, current status of monitoring antibacterial use. Not there. Then you have the use, but the status of monitoring, because that is key. You are in your title and your study subject. If someone asks you at the end of all this, was this work justified? Was there justification for doing this work?
Yes,
What is the justification?
the justification is that the Uganda has adopted a national action plan to slow down the spread and emergence of resistance. And one of the key interventions is to optimize the use of antibacterials.
Okay.
And as a prerequisite, it is important to monitor how antibacterials are used. But then this is often not done in children under 5, and the method of self-report that is often used has been shown to have a low validity. Then another rationale is also that there is a high out-of-pocket use of antibacterials, and this encourages non-prescription use of antibacterials, which could also predispose to inappropriate use of antibacterials.
Okay. So justification in terms of resources that were invested, justification in terms of the HR, human resource that was invested, okay. In terms of the time that was spent doing this research, okay. Is there value for money for this work done? CIDA gave you funds, are they realizing the benefit, their value for the money they injected into this research work?
Yes, I think there is value for money because one, we managed to come up with a method, innovated a method, which method can later on be used even for other studies, like let's say for therapeutic drug monitoring. The method can be modified and used for quantification of drug levels.
Okay, so we came up with a method one. What is the other value for money?
Another value for money is we managed to publish some papers.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Published papers, that is.
Yeah.
So the scientific detail has gained, is information. Okay, what else?
And also, knowledge-wise, I think I've benefited from the study.
Yes.
Then also, I think also clinicians will benefit from this study, because now there will be reports to be aware that people actually take medicines before coming to the home facility, and then try to look for better ways of getting information from them. And also, same policy makers will also benefit from this study by coming up with evidence-based intervention.
Okay, so it should be clear. I think it's there in your book, but you need to have this on your fingertips. But this is your work, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, this is your work. Now let's now go to the methodology, the study area. The choice of the area and the choice of the population. What were the demographic characteristics and the healthcare setting, the area where you live? So that is very, very important. And you flash them, if you have them on the slide. Demographic characteristics.
I have this in my slide. The study study was carried out in Europe, which is the north of Uganda, about 360 kilometers from Kampala. And then by the time of our study, the population size was estimated to be 295,613. And then the main economic activity of the population is subsistence agriculture.
Yeah, the details are missing in the write-up, the demographic, the healthcare settings, that area, which would justify why you chose that area. The information has to be somewhere in your book. Please include it, some detail, the demographic characteristics, and also the specific healthcare settings of that particular area to justify your research questions and your conclusions. So now we go to the LC liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry method. Yes. So the methodology, I think, is well described on how you chose volunteers, how you tested validity, the specificity of the method. That one is well done. But when we reach here, on the dosage combinations, to these dosage combinations for the different volunteers in a scientific way. We take this volunteer B, we take this volunteer C, we take this. What guided you? Such an approach.
We used this approach because we wanted to mimic what is done in the community. And even most times, a person will take whatever medicine is available. And then also, most of the healthcare workers usually prescribe what is available with them, is what they give the patient. So that is what we use. We did not base it on any pharmacological background. We wanted to mimic what is happening in the community.
It's documented. It's documented in your book. Yes, you analyzed and you administered the volunteers, but how you arrived at those combinations, you could have omitted in the write-up to include how you arrived at those combinations. And check it's there. It's not, then you will add it. Okay. So it was based on observation, isn't it?
Yes.
So what you observed is what you applied in the methodology, and you include it as your observation. Okay. And then you make reference to the data that you generated, and then you include it as well. Because you said it mimics, in your own words, it mimics what is done in the community. So That means the information is there, but you did not. I think you also went ahead, but probably the results were, the outcome was affected by the pharmacokinetics, which I think is correct. So if you were to quantify, what you said you never quantified, just analyze using the sports. If you have to quantify, pharmacologists, if you have to quantify the levels, what method would you use? What would you have recommended? What people are going to follow up in the recommendations to recommend that future research quantification be done. So which method would you recommend?
I don't get the question.
What are the methods we use to quantify, let's say, plasma levels of antibiotics? The methodologies. What do we have?
Usually, we use a quantitative tool to analyze the data. Then in this quantitative tool, we get the peak level and with it and retention time, and we use it to quantify it based on some known concentration.
Or if this was not part of your objectives, you tell me it was not part of my objectives, and we move on. That's the answer.
It was not part of the objectives, but but you asked me, so I
Yes.
thought, yeah.
Okay, so there are methods to quantify in addition to the LCMS. So briefly take us through results in summary. Sub-study 1, what were the key findings?
In sub-study 1, the prevalence of antibacterial use was high, both in diarrhea and acute respiratory infection. And then the factors that were associated with antibacterial use were included getting treatment from the health facility, children who are reported to have come from peri-urban areas, and then also children who had cough, those who had fast breathing, and then those who had diarrhea and ARI.
Okay. Sub-study 2, summary of the findings.
In sub-study 2, we managed to develop a method for screening 15 commonly used antibacterials in children under 5. The method was validated and for all the 15 antibacterials within the acceptable range. And also we managed to apply the method in healthy volunteers and were able to identify the antibacterials in these healthy volunteers.
Then sub-study 3.
In sub-study 3, there was underreporting of prior antibacterial use by caregivers of children under 5.
Okay. Yes, in results for sub-study 2, can you flash the chromatograms? Yes. So this is what we got here in the analysis. And you mentioned the retention time for the different antibiotics or antibacterials. The retention time, what does it reflect? How do you interpret retention time? What does it signify in terms of the outcomes of your objective?
The retention time basically tells us how long the analyte takes to move through the column after injection of the mixture. The time it takes to move through the colon until it is eluded.
Okay. Did you participate hands-on in running the LCMS experiments?
I participated in the extraction and then making of the stock solution, the standard solution. However, when it came to loading the samples, because I was using a private laboratory, I was not allowed to touch the machine. But then the time for reading the results, I had the software. So I was able to read the results myself.
So you are able to interpret
Yes.
what is on the chromatograph.
Yeah.
Okay. So what practical skills have you acquired from this research study? They may be applied in terms of public health aspects. They may be applied in the laboratory. What skills have you gained that are going to carry you in the future?
At least I learned how to use data software analysis, and also I learned some basic statistics, and also in the lab I learned how to make the stock solution, the standard solution, how to extract from DBS and DUS. And then also I learned writing skills of the paper, and also and how to.
So I haven't seen in your write-up, apart from this difference, how your study subjects will get to know the findings of this work, the community where you did this work, the health workers there, the district health leadership. So you are just going to share this work in the book. I don't see in your write-up how they are going to benefit from this work. Because the scientific community, you have published some how will the health workers, because you had some findings there, the level of education of the healthcare workers, the low level of knowledge of the population in the area, the educational level. So how will they get this information?
The health facilities that I carried out the study, at least will get a copy of the book, we'll get copies of the book, and then also the ministry will get a copy. Then also the district authorities will get the copies. But now the people in the rural community, I don't know how they will be able to get this information.
So overall, get us a clear dissemination strategy for your work. Overall, the community where you did work. Let us a clear dissemination strategy to the scientific community, to the implementers of health, put a clear implementation dissemination strategy in the write-up. Okay. So when you write, you avoid many questions. Omitted aspects which should have been included in your book. If they were there, will not be asking you how you are going to disseminate this. I'm not saying it, dissemination. It is very, very important because your findings definitely will help the scientific community in the health sector. Last but not least, I would like to commend you for the work that you did and for the data generated. I believe you have corrected and taken care of the recommendations which I made, which I thought were important to address the gaps in the book. And also, thank you for having your team, your supervisors, for having published in journals, scientific journals. Why did you choose the +1? One of my publications is in +1. So how did you arrive at +1? Why not any other journal?
Yeah, we chose +1 because of the scope of the work, the type of papers they usually publish, which was our papers were in line with the kind of papers they publish.
Okay. What was the process before you got this paper published? What was the process? How this paper got published in +1?
We analyzed the data, we wrote the paper, and then looked around the journals, and one which was within the scope of our study, and then the requirements for publication, the format, how the diagrams are supposed to be formatted and everything. Yes, then we submitted and started doing the review.
Okay. How many reviews did you get? How many times did you have to submit?
For the first paper,
Yes.
the first time it was a major review.
Okay.
Then it came to minor, then another minor, then it was accepted.
You learn anything out of that experience?
Yeah, I learned how to be patient.
No. Huh? Were the recommendations of the reviewers asking for patience or something else? What were they asking for?
Mainly it was in the method section. Yeah, some of the work I had to reanalyze it.
Yeah, precision.
Yeah.
Not patience. Okay, then you also published in BMC Public Health. What is its impact factor?
I don't have that.
You need to find out. Where you publish is also important. Not every journal having a publication is not the issue. Where you publish is also important. Yeah, there are some journals which have particular names, predator and so on. And then International Journal of Pharma. What's the third journal for the methodology?
I published 2 papers, the first one, then
Yeah.
one in PhD, yeah, then in the National Journal of Farm Tech.
So as I conclude again, as yes, dental, then pharmacologist, then public health pharmacologist, where do you see yourself in the future, carrying on this work?
I'll continue with public health pharmacology.
Public health pharmacology. You have very few, so glad to see you grow in that area.
Thank you very much, Professor Agawa, for that interaction with the student. It was lovely, really lovely. Now open the examining to my other panelists. First, we have Professor Emeritus Willie Anokubongo. This time I got the name right. Right?
It is right now.
You are welcome, sir.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to thank the chairperson of the Department of Pharmacology and Therapeutics for inviting me to be a member of the panel. Secondly, I would like to appreciate the work of the supervisors of this thesis. And thirdly, although I did not read it in a way as an internal examiner would have read it, it gave me a very good reading, because it is clearly written, and I went through it fast enough. Now, there are 1 or 2 things which I would like the candidate to maybe enlighten us on. Oh, let me first of all point 1 or 2 small things which I have observed through the reading of the thesis. I've seen that the third supervisor did not sign your thesis, and I think that is important. Get it done so that it is official. And then secondly, there is this PH always disturbs people. It's a typographical error. It is a small p, not a capital C, with a capital H. And that you will find on page Roman 13, I think, yeah. And I would like to say that US, it is not maybe good to say US and then you say this stands for United States of America. Why don't you put USA and then state that one? Because US, maybe a anomaly. Now, what I would like the candidate to enlighten us on, there is somewhere where she has written that during the data analysis in the laboratory, some data were lost. I thought at that stage, data protection is secured through, and sorry. This one. I have not yet finished.
You're still going on.
Yeah. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. loss of data during laboratory analysis. How would this happen when you have gone through the collection and so forth, and you lose the data at that stage of your research? Anyway, you would just enlighten us on that one. And then you have given it during the presentation, but I did not see it on the write-up. 15 commonly used antibacterial agents. But during the presentation, I think it was a slip of the tongue, you mentioned gentamicin, which I did not find here, to my, happiness. Because when these caregivers are initiating the antibacterial use, they don't know. I mean, they use the route. I mean, the oral route is the best. But gentamicin cannot be given for that systemic effect by the oral route. That was my concern when you mentioned it in your presentation, but it is not in the write-up. And then you have mentioned somewhere in the thesis, but I was not very clear on those criteria which you used to exclude some of these patients from your data. Last but not least, this has a very important policy implication. I hope it will not remain in your thesis. I hope those concerned will be informed accordingly, because, the use of antibacterial agents, irrational use, is very common. And I think the authorities concerned are able to really prevent this. And some of this use in the community, some of the use of drugs in the community may not follow the duration of time which is recommended to treat acute respiratory tract infection, diarrhea, or whatever they want to treat. And I came across certain situations when over-the-counter drugs are given for 1 or 2 days. Gross irrational use. So I hope what you have collected here will not remain in your book. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Prof. Please take his comments, they are very key. I will now listen to Professor Paul Nyachika.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for inviting me to be an internal examiner for this candidate, Dr. Lanyero. Hindum or Hindum? Hindum. Your thesis was very interesting, and I enjoyed reading it. Such as a very important subject. And thank you for your presentation that has made some things clearer than I had thoughts from the thesis. I'm happy to be your internal examiner, and I'm privileged to sit next to Professor Anokbong, who was my teacher in undergraduate So I will ask a few questions. Overall, it's well written and touches a very important subject of public health. I heard you at the end say you're going into public health pharmacology, but I think you're somewhere between. When I read your objectives and research question and the title, vis-a-vis the title says monitoring antibacterial use in children under 5 years in rural communities of northern Uganda. So I immediately thought it was a prospective study. But when I went into the details, I found that it was a cross-sectional study. So I wondered how the title monitoring, how suitable this title was for your dissertation, your thesis. And I'm happy that the external examiner actually asked about a baseline, because if you're monitoring, it's important that you show us somewhere something as baseline and then as follow-up, but it's not anywhere in your thesis. My other major challenge was with the caretakers and the study. This study was conducted in a rural setting. I kept wondering, these mothers in the rural setting or caretakers, what was their ability to identify antibacterial agents? I know that in the limitation in the discussion, you mentioned something about it, but what effect does that have on the results of your study? Does it underestimate or overestimate your data, your results? Because we know that many people, especially in the rural communities, may not know which medicines they take. Further still, you go ahead to show us results and discuss that people with higher education and people living in the urban areas, actually, in your discussion, are more likely to take antibacterial agents before coming to the hospital. But your data shows that the people in the rural areas had a high prevalence, and yet these people are also more likely to be of lower education status. So I'm wondering how the two tie up. Your conclusion says, and recommendations, there's need for targeted education on appropriate use in rural communities. This I've got from your abstract before I go into detail. But when I read your abstract, there was nothing to do with education or knowledge. So I wondered where this conclusion came from. It doesn't seem to arise from the data presented in the book. And if I may go into the details of the book, the definitions. You defined sensitivity and positive predictive value and specificity. However, the definitions that you give in the book are not standard definitions of sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value. I would have preferred that you give the standard definition of sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value, and then follow this up with how you applied it to your study, such that another reader or another student or another scientist who wants to learn what sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value are can actually get them by reading what is in your book. But the way it is written is not very, it does not portray the actual meaning of these terminologies. So I'd request that you go back and revise this and put the actual terminologies and then define how you applied them, how you calculated them in your study. To go on, so you went on to study two. Study one, you estimated the prevalence, and then study two, you developed a method. And in your justification, you say that getting data from mothers or patients on prior use of antibiotics is often not a very correct estimate. And therefore, you went ahead to develop this method so that you can estimate the use of antibacterials in the community. So I kept wondering, how much does it cost to use this method? And justification for developing a method for predicting prior use of antibiotics, especially in low and middle income settings, and further still in rural settings of northern Uganda. Who is ever going to use this method in the rural setting in northern Uganda to detect how much antibiotics children have taken? And what is it going to cost? In other words, how practical will this be to roll out? Then go to your conceptual framework. It was an interesting conceptual framework. Quite interesting and not the usual conceptual framework. But we know that in Uganda, the major problem with overuse that causes overuse and irrational use of antibiotics is over-the-counter prescription. I mean, over-the-counter dispensing and lax regulation on use of antibiotics. But I don't see it anywhere in your conceptual framework. If you can look at that conceptual framework, it's not portrayed anywhere. The weak system, regulatory system on antibiotics, where anybody can walk into a pharmacy to buy an antibiotic, where even drug shops sell antibiotics. It's not portrayed, and that is a huge problem that causes inappropriate use of antibiotics. So I would be happy if you added that to your conceptual framework. Then on the same page of your conceptual framework, you write predisposing factors leading to use of antibiotics on page 11 at the bottom. And you include sex, social factors such as education, you include occupation and ethnicity. I'm wondering, how do these influence use of antibiotics? How does ethnicity and sex influence use of antibiotics? Are we women more likely to use antibiotics compared to the men, or the reverse? It's not explained, but it's stated. Even the ethnicity is stated, but not explained. Yes?
Questions. Would you like the candidate to respond to some of them? There might be too many at the end that you forget some, but you can.
Okay, that's fine, if we still have time. Okay, good.
I suggest that the candidate answers some of these important questions. Then the prof will proceed.
I think the first question was about the suitability of the title. Well, expected a baseline. I think this was asked by the opponent, and I'm going to look for data from the ministry on the current state of antibiotic use. And then the second one was the ability of caregivers to sell antibiotics. So here we were asking them, which medicine did you give this child during the course of the illness? So they would mention the medicine. It was not us, the data collectors and such assistants, to be able to tell whether this is an antibiotic or not. And in most cases, we also asked them if they had the prescription, if they had the remaining medicines for observation, or the packaging material. And then,
so do you think with that method you under or overestimated? Because many mothers will not know if this is ampicillin or this is chloramphenicol in the rural areas, and many may not even have their prescriptions.
yeah, I think we underestimated. So that is a limitation.
Point of discussion, you think about it.
Yeah. Then you asked a question about peri-urban, but I don't quite get it.
In the discussion and in some literature review, you state that the people living in urban areas are more likely to use antibiotics.
Yeah.
And the more educated are less likely, something like that. But then your data shows a high prevalence in the rural areas of 62%, I think, and 52% for diarrhea and ARI. And then again, you go back to the discussion in the following paragraph. After you have stated the reverse, you contradict with the explanation for your own study. So you have contradicting information. Explain the 62 and 52%. The 60 and 52%.
We carried out the multivariable analysis. We observed that children who were from peri-urban areas were more likely to be given antibiotics compared to those in the rural areas. And our explanation was that these people are enlightened, they have good access to healthcare, and they are also wealthy compared to those in the rural areas. And then the part of the education, it was explaining the education level of the health workers, where researchers showed that health workers who have attained a higher education are less likely to misuse antibiotics compared to those of a lower cadre. And yet we find that in the rural areas, it's usually the health workers of the lower cadre.
Okay, but I think there's some contradiction in your discussion. You go back and read on page 59 and 58. You go back and review and can correct. Did I go on?
Was there another question?
Do you want to respond to any?
Now, the justification of developing this method was developed to screen, to assess for accuracy of self-reports, and probably later on be used for research purposes. We didn't develop this method as to replace self-reports as in for daily use. No, it cannot, it's not cost effective, especially in the rural areas, it cannot be used there.
So you need to add that very clearly in the book, because your justification in the book says you're developing it to replace the medical history we take that is less reliable. So you need to be very specific that you want to use it in specific situations. Otherwise, it may not be very practical using this in those rural areas for routine clinical care. I go on? Okay, I hope you'll also rewrite the definitions. So from your background, you discussed the etiology very well. I just wanted to know, we have come out of a pandemic, COVID pandemic, where use of antibiotics was high up there. But in your background, I don't see anything to do with COVID-19 and increasing the use of antibiotics, although you're discussing factors that contribute to use of antibiotics. I'll be very happy to see that you include that, because our previous studies have shown very high use, irrational use of antibiotics during the COVID pandemic. So please add it. Then when you discuss...
Let me first ask a question, because we carried out this data collection in late 2018 and up to Feb 2019.
True, but you're defending in 2022. So you had a chance before you submitted the book for external exam to update your discussion, update your factors influencing antibiotic use, so you could have added that. And now you're going to have the final book probably at the end of 2022, ready for graduation. So it would be important for you to update since you're a PhD student. Okay, then you discuss causes of diarrhea, both in the background, literature review, and in the discussion. And you say food is a major cause of diarrhea. I read that and I was wondering how food causes diarrhea. I think you mean contaminated food, and you should say what it's contaminated with. Otherwise, somebody reading your book starts to wonder where you're coming from. Okay, if we can go on. Yes, on page 27 and in your presentation, inclusion criteria. So for study 1, you included children under 5 who had had either an acute respiratory illness or diarrhea 2 weeks preceding the data collection. And in sub-study 3, you included children under 5 years who were brought to the healthcare facilities for treatment. So my question for sub-study 3, did you sample children who had been brought for treatment for any ailment, or was it still for ARI and diarrhea? How did that influence your study? Did it have any influence on your study?
I don't think so.
Why?
We were interested in sprays of antibacterials before coming to the health facility. So for any condition that a child is brought with, we wanted to assess that with them.
You didn't relate it at all to the prevalence of use or anything? It was only for the sensitivity and specificity?
We calculated the prevalence.
Even in the third sub-study?
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to get clear. So if you did in the third sub-study and you're comparing to the first sub-study at all, don't you think that if in the first sub-study you're restricting to ARI and diarrhea, and in the third you're taking every child, including those with road traffic accident or who have fallen while playing dodgeball, you're going to get differences? Because children are more likely to be given antibiotics if they have ARI and diarrhea compared to any other. Think through it. Okay, and then if we can go along, in your exclusion criteria writing on page 27, you say in sub-study 2, we excluded healthy adult volunteers who had not taken any antibacterials for at least 1 month, but were not available during the exact time of sample collection. This statement is vague and wrong. I think you meant you, first of all, included healthy adult volunteers who had not taken antibacterials in the last 3 months. And then you excluded those who were not available. Actually, you didn't exclude them, you just lost them, who are not available on the day of sampling.
At the exact time, but they had taken antibacterials, but
So we excluded healthy adult volunteers who had not taken any antibacterials. Is that correct?
yes.
What was the inclusion criteria?
To be included, you should have not taken any antibacterials for at least 1 month.
Okay, but now you're saying you excluded healthy adult volunteers who had not taken any antibacterials. Is that correct?
Yes. Because I thought to be excluded, you should have first met the inclusion criteria.
So if you've included them, how do you then exclude them?
We removed them from the study because they were not available at the exact time of data sample collection.
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying this first part of the statement is wrong. You need to unwrap, to disconnect these two parts of the statements, because you included healthy adult volunteers who had not taken any antibacterials, but you have written that you excluded healthy adult volunteers who had not taken antibacterials. You get my point? Okay. Then in sub-study 3, you excluded caretakers of children. Let me read the whole statement. In sub-study 3, we excluded children under 5 years who were brought to the healthcare facilities for treatment by caregivers who did not take care of children process of the sickness. The sentence is vague, you need to correct it. But after that vague sentence, you say, critically ill children were excluded from the study. Do you think that was a source of selection bias in your study?
We didn't want to include critically ill children.
Why?
First of all, we are getting samples, urine and blood.
But in terms of the methods of the study, and in terms of internal validity, how did that affect your study?
Yes, I think it is selection bias.
So the children who are critically ill could have been the same children who are more likely to have received antibiotics before coming to the hospital. Don't you think so?
Yeah.
So you need to discuss that, if at all is what you did. If we continue on, in your presentation and also in your book, you do not give us the real sampling technique that you used for sub-study 1. How did you select the children to include in sub-study 1?
The children were randomly selected.
Describe to us the random selection, because it's not stated in the book.
Okay, we moved in the different households and identified those children under 5 who had diarrhea.
How did you select which households to go to? And how did you select which children in the household to include? It's not stated in your book, neither was it in your presentation.
The households were randomly selected.
Oh, what random? Describe to us the random selection of households.
We just moved in the different households in the village and we called. Okay, we reached the LC's place and got permission. After getting permission, we took different directions.
So how did you select which households to go to?
We moved in all households until.
So Dr. Hindum, your selection of participants to include is not clarified in your book, neither is it in the presentation, and it's a big source of bias. It affects your internal validity. You need to discuss it very well, or you need to state exactly what you did, and I hope that it was actually done in a systematic way. Otherwise, discuss it as a major source of bias. Okay. The next question is about the pharmacology. This is an intersection of pharmacology and public health. Sub-study 2, your aim was to develop a method to detect antibacterial agents, either blood or urine. But we know that the PK of any drug is influenced by several factors. The drug pharmacological properties and any other factors, including age, including things like taking it with food or without food for some drugs, the pH of the stomach at any one time for different drugs. But your book does not discuss the pharmacology of these drugs at all. So how did you set out to determine that I'm going to use blood, dry blood, or dry urine to be able to detect an antibiotic X, when you have not told us in your literature review that this antibiotic X, once taken orally, is either metabolized or not metabolized, is either excreted in feces or in urine or in sweat or, and what is excreted? Is it the antibiotic in its original state or is it in a modified state? Your book does not cover that at all. So how do we know that the method you develop is actually targeting this. And then you go ahead to say that, both in your presentation and in the book, that you detected these, some after 1 hour and others after 3 hours. But we don't have any background literature on the PK profile of these substances. So how do we believe your results? I think it's very, very important that you review the pharmacology of all the drugs that you selected and include a section in your book that describes their pharmacology, their pharmacological properties. I don't know if you have any response to that.
No, I thought because I included this in one of the papers I published. And
It's not in the book, not in the literature review, not in the discussion. And then the way the specimens you used, blood and urine. How did you select whether to use blood or urine and not sweat or saliva or hair? And 2, which urine samples did you take? Was it early stream, midstream, or late stream? Was it early morning, late in the night, or in the afternoon? Because we know all these factors affect what you're going to be able to harvest in the urine. Even the blood, the way you took the blood is not described. Was it venous blood or arterial blood? There is no description of it at all in the book. Okay? And then you stored these dry spots. In your write-up, you say you stored at -20 degrees centigrade and -80 for the urine, -80, and the blood -20. Why? Why did you store dry blood spots at -20 degrees centigrade and dry urine spots at -80 degrees centigrade?
I got that from literature.
That you store dry blood spots at -80, -20, and dry urine?
Yes, I got it from a published paper.
Okay, even if you got it from a published paper, why? Why would they do that? Because you're a scientist, you're a PhD candidate, you should always ask the question, why? Does that mean that if you leave dry blood spot or dry urine spot at room temperature, it's going to disintegrate and you will not be able to get what you're looking for? Or does it mean that the cold temperatures preserve it? Which is which? It's not indicated anywhere. Then in your presentation, you kept referring to the p-values, saying the children who had cough, the p-value for the children who had cough was smaller than the p-value for the children who had diarrhea. And that means that the ones who had cough were more likely to be given antibiotics. My question to you, what do we use the p-value for? What is the meaning of a p-value?
The p-value is it shows us the level of significance.
So why were you saying that cough, because the p-value is smaller than the diarrhea, therefore it means the children with cough are more likely to be given antibiotics? So there's a difference between a measure of association and a measure of statistical significance. What is the difference between the two?
Measure of association shows us the connection between the dependent.
The connection, what do you mean the connection? You're a PhD candidate.
Association again.
No, you're a PhD candidate.
It shows us the association between the dependent and independent variable.
Yes, so it shows us the direction of the association. What else does it show us?
It also shows us the level of significance, how strong this association.
Shows us the magnitude of the association.
Yeah.
So what measure of association were you considering here?
Yeah, I was associating the.
What was the measure of association? How did you measure which which statistic did you use to measure the association?
I used the random effects logistic regression.
What was the measure of association? Was it an odds ratio? Was it a risk ratio? Was it?
For the universal analysis, I used odds ratio.
So anyway, what I'm trying to say, Hindum, you need to include the statistical and epidemiological aspects in your book, as well as your presentation, because you're a PhD candidate, okay? The interpretation should show that you have done some courses in epidemiology, both the interpretation in oral presentation as well as in the book, but that doesn't come out very well, okay? Oh, yes, I'll finish in 2 minutes.
Right.
So I know that your essay was really qualitative. Was it quantitative? Qualitative. Qualitative. Okay, yes. But even then, even if it was qualitative, the pharmacological aspects are very, very important, because to be able to say, yes, it's present or not present, you still need that pharmacology. So almost finally, you told us about a kappa statistic. Can you please interpret your kappa statistic? Because you gave us a kappa statistic somewhere of 0.06 overall.
Yes,
Yes, what does that mean?
it is slightly.
Sorry?
The connection between self-report and amount of antibiotics in the sample is slightly poor.
So I request that you go back and review the literature and include in your book the ranges for the kappa statistic. When do you say it is slightly, the agreement is slight, the agreement is fair, the agreement is moderate, and the agreement is substantial? Because it's very important for the work you have done, but you haven't included it at all. Then almost finally, yes, almost finally, you talk about causes of diarrhea in your discussion. And you say most causes of non-bloody diarrhea in children are rotavirus examples. And then you go on to mention the causes of non-bloody diarrhea. And you mention these are Shigella, enteroinvasive Escherichia coli, and these may justify antibacterial use in children on page 57. I'm wondering, is that correct? And if you think it's correct, where did you get this? Causes of non-bloody diarrhea in children listed in your thesis.
57.
Yes, the last 3 sentences.
I got it from a systematic review.
But from your own knowledge, from your own training as a doctor, what are the causes of bloody diarrhea in children? Are they Shigella and E. coli? I mean non-bloody diarrhea.
Virus.
Yeah, but you've stated E. coli, Shigella, and it's surprising to the reader that you are stating these in your presentation. Thank you very much. I'll stop there, and I'll give you a copy of the book so that you can use it too.
Thank you very much, Prof. That was comprehensive. We have another examiner online, but I'll first take the one who is here, Dr. Lydia Bunalema, and then Frederick will come.
Thank you, Chairperson. Examiner student. Dr. Hindum, thank you for the work that you have done. It has brought us unveiled good results. And I hope that the wide community where you're addressing your work will be able to use it. I'll be brief because the other examiners have been exhaustive. Dr. Henry, in your first sub-study, you did a survey. How many households did you survey in?
911.
911. And out of these, you were able to identify 15 antibiotics that are used in the community for treatment of ARIs and diarrhea. However, it is not clear in your work how these were distributed in the community. How many of the households mentioned which antibiotics? And to add on that, the results for the antibiotics that were mentioned were missing in the book. So please include that and give us that statistics, how many tallied with what, because I know that your questionnaire has that provision. And then your objectives, can you flash your objectives, please? I think the general objective, investigate antibacterial use and develop methods of fancy there, better information on previous antibacterial intake in rural settings should be modified so that it is clear and it is precisely stated. Can we go to slide 33? Right. Slide 33 shows the chromatogram that you got from analysis of the 15 antibiotics that you measured. I can see that from your chromatogram, there are different colors that are shown there, but you are not telling us which color tallies with which antibiotic. I think that should be done well. And also, you could manipulate that chromatogram so that it is clear enough. From a layman's person, if you tell them that this chromatogram is tallying with 15 antibiotics, they cannot understand it because some of the chromatogram are overlapping the others. If possible, you could separate it so that you have one that shows the ones that are this side, the extreme side, and the ones that are on the other side. Secondly, you mentioned that you did only qualitative analysis. And I'm wondering why you did not do the quantitative analysis, yet you are using LC-MS. From my chemistry, I think this is one of the methods that is very accurate in determining quantities and also determining presence. Because if you are only doing presence of determining presence of an antibiotic, there are other methods that you have used other than LC, MS, and then coupled with MS. Don't you think that there was some kind of waste in your analysis of results? One would be very interested if you did an LC-MS to determine the quantities other than only presence, because that can be determined even by GCMS. I need an answer to that one.
You see, to be able to quantify, you need to know when the person took the medication and how much was taken. And then also,
that is not true, Hindum.
And then
LC-MS, you don't need that information. Actually, from your graphs, that big pink graph, I can determine the quantity of that antibiotic just by looking at that graph and getting how much is there. I can determine its quantity. I don't have to have any prior information. Actually, with LC-MS, if you have the method very well, you can determine what and how much at the same time.
Yeah, that is very good. And I think I'll put it as part of future research because it It was not part of the objective of the study. We developed the method just to be able to screen and after the gold standard, testing for accuracy.
All right, that is okay. Can we go to slide 23? Slide 23. In that table, you say that you're showing the socio-demographic and illness characteristics of caregivers and under fives. But when I look at your graph, I'm not seeing the illness characteristics in the graph. Can you please show us those illness characteristics that you're talking about? in that
No,
graph?
by the illness characteristics, because we are looking at diarrhea and acute respiratory tract infection. So I had to just include the number of people who had diarrhea and those who had ARIs. So that's what I meant by illness characteristics.
All right. Hindum, when you develop a method, there is what they call precision and accuracy. And from your, can you just show us that data from your method development?
No, the guideline we use
Oh,
for
I've not yet asked the question. What is precision?
precision is how close the value is to the concentration you're measuring.
Did you determine this in your study?
No, we didn't,
Why didn't you?
because we are not dealing with quantitative data. We are not measuring concentration, and also the guidelines used for qualitative studies does not mention determining accuracy, recovery, what is the guideline recommended for qualitative evaluation.
What about accuracy?
The same question. Accuracy is how close is a value, but here we are still not getting.
Maybe we should go back, Hindu. You first spiked using pure drugs, using standards, and you got us the different chromatograms for the standards.
Yes.
Then you got your dry blood samples, and you again determined presence. I'm thinking that for us to tell us that a method is valid, you should give us how precise this method is as compared to your spiking data and how accurate it is. I think you will go back and look into that. Maybe you will be able to provide an answer to that. My final question. My final question is, do you think, because you say that the problem that you are solving from your discussion with the opponent was inappropriate drug use? Am I right, Hindum?
Yes.
Do you think that your results have addressed this problem? And if they have, to what extent have they solved the problem? Thank you, Chair.
Okay, because we discovered that antibiotics have been used inappropriately to treat children who have viral infection. And then we have made a recommendation to improve this practice.
What is the recommendation?
One is to inform policymakers that interventions are put in place to improve the practice of the healthcare workers, probably through in-service training, and then also to educate the community about appropriate antibiotic use. And then, if possible, to also enforce the prescription use of antibiotics, the law.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Lydia.
Mr. Chair, I just want to make a comment on that. Hindum, I think you need to correct that in your book. I think you did not actually address inappropriate use or overuse, because you did a cross-sectional study. You went out and measured prevalence of antibiotic use, but you don't have information to add to that statement you have said to determine whether it was inappropriate use of antibiotics from the way the book, the studies were conducted. So you need to edit to qualify your statements.
I was thinking inappropriate in terms of indication.
But you don't have that information. It's not anywhere in the book.
I have, they're using non-blooded diarrhea.
You went out and sampled children to find out if they had used antibiotics in the past. But you did not have reasons why they had used antibiotics, except you looked at those who had had ARI and diarrhea. You did not go back into their medical records to see, was this drug appropriately prescribed or not? In the real sense of research, you don't have that information.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Chico. Your study is very interesting. That's why you are getting many questions. It's a very interesting subject, so don't worry at all. Dean Emeritus Fred Kitutu, are you online?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we hear you loud and clear. Please go ahead and engage the student.
Thank you very much. My name is Fred Kitutu. I extend my gratitude to the School of Biomedical Sciences for giving me this opportunity, and I congratulate Dr. Hindum Lanyero for reaching this stage and for writing a very interesting thesis out of her work. Obviously, as already mentioned by colleagues earlier, this is an important research question that addresses one of the top 5 health issues that threatens sustainable development and particularly healthcare achievement of targets within the SDG that focuses on health. Dr. Lanyero, I just want us to remind us again, why is it important to understand how antimicrobials are used? I know you've said this before, but if you can just remind us.
It's important to understand how bacteria are used so as to prevent the emergency and spread of resistance.
Okay, so yes, use of antimicrobials, whether appropriate or not, is one of the known drivers of antimicrobial resistance. Now, from your understanding, in terms of prioritizing, which sectors do you think are most important if we are to address the current challenge of antimicrobial resistance? Which settings?
The private sector.
A private sector, that is, for instance, we know that it is a One Health issue. We also know that a lot of antimicrobials are used in healthcare. Your study focuses on the community. So if you to prioritize a surveillance of antimicrobial consumption and use, which would be the first 2 settings or 3? And where do you think a surveillance within the community would fall?
There's the health sector, and then we have the animal sector, veterinary, or the food chain sector. Then we have the environmental sector. So the
Okay.
community will fall under, I think, the health sector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hindum. So you've mentioned the healthcare setting. I think that current evidence really points that there's a lot of use and exposure in hospital settings, clinics, and as you mentioned, those that are privately owned. Do you think that we could still have an idea of what is happening in the community by simply focusing on antimicrobial use and consumption in hospitals and medical centers, whether they are public or private?
Come again?
Do you think that we could get the same information you're looking for in the community by simply focusing on understanding which antimicrobials are being used in the health facilities, whether private or public?
I don't think so, because of self-medication is a common practice in Uganda, and studies have shown that. So if you only focus on the health in the hospitals in the hospitals, we will not be able to get the exact what is happening in the community.
All right, thank you very much. By the self-medication, still the patients have to get the agents, the antibiotic agents from somewhere. Don't you think that if we went to the private outlets, we'd still get an idea of how much is being consumed? If not, then why so?
Something we found out that in retail shops, not even pharmacies or drug shops, people are getting antibiotics from retail shops. And then also people have a habit of storing medicine at home. They don't, maybe the balance from the previous treatment, they store it at home. Although also getting information from the private, from the pharmacies and drug shops would also give us a picture of what is happening in the community.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hindum. I agree. Beyond looking at the source, the potential source of these antibiotic agents, why is it still important for us to study antimicrobial use in the households and the community broadly? What else?
Yes, we talked of self-medication with these antibiotics in the community, and then also, like I said, we need to know whether these people are complying to treatment, they're following or taking the right dose, and also, I think that is it.
Yeah, I agree. In other words, there are a number of other factors that we need to address in terms of ensuring that the households and communities are also change their behavior towards behaviors that conserve the current effective antibiotics. I will now zero down to your study 3, where you validated the method and showed that, of course, showed that the estimates using blood samples and urine are much higher than when you get self-reports for which under 5 child had actually taken which antimicrobial. I thought that was quite important, and I just want you to summarize for us again which antimicrobials did you find from analyzing the dried blood samples and urine to have substantial proportions among your study group?
I think put it here.
Uh,
The most common ones were amoxicillin, cotrimoxazole, and metronidazole.
Metronidazole. Mm.
And then we also had Cipro.
Okay, yes, that's yeah. I want you to tell us more about those, particularly Cipro. You found that 46 out of 355 under 5 children had ciprofloxacin identified in their samples. Did you try to think about that a little more? Again, taking into account the fact that ciprofloxacin is indicated for use in older children, and then I'm not sure whether we have any child appropriate formulations.
I didn't think about that, but we discovered that they're being given to children probably by breaking them in 2 halves. But that is what we found in the sample.
Yeah, yeah, so you concluded that that these children are actually being prescribed ciprofloxacin. Could there be another explanation? Could there be an issue of measurement bias? Could it be that they are ingesting it through the food they eat, or?
Yeah, that is also a possibility that probably they were exposed to these antibiotics through the food chain.
Yeah. But from your clinical practice, is it common to inject under 5s with ciprofloxacin? And I mean, from the anecdotal data and from your discussions through your PhD process.
It's not common.
Yeah, and that leads me to my question. In terms of these proportions, do you think that it would be important? Of course, you recommend that future studies should aim to quantify. Do you think that it would be important to interrogate this data further to determine which of these proportions are actually representative of under 5 children who were prescribed through the normal channels from those who could have gotten exposure to these agents through unconventional methods, for instance, as you mentioned for Cipro. What is your comment on that?
Yes, that is why I recommended that future studies need to quantify the levels of these antibiotics in blood and urine, so that we can be able, from the quantity, we can be able to tell which we can be able to tell whether these are traces that the children got exposed to from other sources like the food chain, or they actually prescribed. But all this will also depend on the time when the children were given the antibiotics.
Okay, thank you. I will now go to, again, the issue that sub-study 3 brings out, the limitations of self-reports. And I will focus on some of the factors associated with antibiotic use that you report in paper 1 and paper 2. My understanding is these factors were also examined. The data was collected through self-reports. For instance, in terms of the signs and symptoms that under 5 children were reported to have prior to seeking treatment. Were those also collected through self-reports?
Yes.
And what is then given that sub-study 3 demonstrates that self-reports have challenges, particularly for antibiotic use. Do you think the same challenges could apply to how you collected data for the other factors? If not, then what did you do to ensure that your data was valid?
Of course, because we use self-reports, it was prone to recall bias. So we try to minimize this by using a recall period of 2 weeks. And there's also information bias, and we minimize this by using closed-ended questions and also piloting the tool.
Okay.
And then social desirability bias, we try to minimize this by, in the first sub-study, we minimized it by not moving around with the village authorities or the PhDs. And then in the third sub-study, we try to minimize that by excluding, carrying out our research separately from the staff, apart from just, we involve the staff only in collection of blood samples.
Okay, I agree, and those are well documented in literature. Did you also look at the period of recall under which you expected the respondents to provide information? Did you, for instance, ask them about antibiotic use more than 2 weeks preceding your interview and so on?
We concentrated on 2 weeks only because literature suggests that 2 weeks is a good recall period to prevent recall bias.
Yes. So, do you think that those are the same explanations that explain why we may have underreporting, underestimation of antibiotic use when we use self-reports as a method?
Yes, and I think I put it under I explained it in the limitations.
Yes. Yeah, but then you went ahead in your sub-study, in your paper 3, to recommend for further research. And the reason I'm raising this is that, don't you think we know enough about factors that could contribute to underreporting, underestimation using self-reports? Do we need to really study that? I mean, it is your main conclusion, but it's something that you might want to think about further as you revise your book. I think that there are probably more interesting conclusions out of that work. I will now continue and focus on sensitivity and specificity. And I think, again, that is for the study where you validate the method. You report the sensitivity and specificity of your novel method. What was not clear to me was what was the gold standard? What was the reference for sensitivity and specificity for the novel method you developed?
Oh, the method of sub-study too.
Yes.
This selectivity and sensitivity was calculated based on a formula, which is the guideline for validation.
Yes. So what was your reference? So I imagine that you needed to have a gold standard, and then you had your test method, which in this case is determining presence of the selected antibiotics using liquid chromatography with single quadruple mass spectrometry and tandem mass spec. So what I want to understand is, did you have another method against which you compared? And in this case, I'm referring to that other method as the reference or the gold standard to report sensitivity and specificity of your novel, because I know that in sub-study 3, then you test self-report against it. But what is not clear is whether you had, what your reference was when you're developing and checking the validity of your novel method.
When we are validating this method, like I said, the acceptable range, as you can see each of the slides there, and these ranges are based on a formula. We didn't have another gold standard to compare our developed method with. We just went ahead after developing it, and then we tested it on healthy volunteers to see whether it is able to detect the antibacterial, which was possible.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I will leave that at that, but then ask you between all the parameters you used for assessing the performance of your methods, which one do you think is most important for application? I mean, between or among sensitivity, specificity, likelihood, positive predictive value. If we are to choose one of those for us who want to use the method in the field, in our studies, which one would you recommend for us to look at and why?
I think that okay, to apply the method in the field, it is use the positive predictive value and the negative predictive value. But now to assess for the association between self-report and the lab test, it's better to use the Kappa coefficient.
Yeah, yes, I think that I would also go with the positive predictive value. So from your findings, what was the positive predictive value of your novel method? And what are some of the other variables that we would need to think about?
The positive predictive value was 76.5.
Meaning, what does that mean to a layman like me?
It means that of the people who tested positive in the lab, 39 was reported, had self-reported taking antibiotics before coming to the health facility. That is 39 out of 206.
All right. Thank you very much. And of course, we also know that things like the prior probability of the variable you're trying to measure affects positive predictive value and so on. And I will leave that discussion at this point. I think that that is very important for you to clarify. I will then move to what my colleagues have already touched, but focus on the fact that your studies were conducted in households, in villages, or in health facilities, which from the epidemiological point of view, I may introduce some form of clustering that could affect some of the observations. And in your sampling, you clearly state that you did a multi-stage sampling, which again, I think was reasonable given the structure of your data collection units. But then in your analysis, I do not see how you carried that forward. If for instance, you think there was potential clustering among children who sought care in one health facility, or among households in one village, which creates intra-class correlation and inter-class correlation issues. How did you address that in your analysis to ensure that you actually reflected the fact that your sampling was multi-stage?
Now we use to calculate the prevalence, since we are using clustered sampling. We use clustered robust standard errors with the village as our cluster variable. Then to account for clustering, for both univariable and multivariable analysis, we use random effects logistic regression and still maintain unit as our cluster variable.
So do you think that that is adequate to address any hierarchical structure within your data? Are you able, for instance, to identify factors that may be acting at the health facility level from those that are acting at the under 5 child level, using that approach that you mentioned?
Yes, I think because for the sub-study one, we carried it at households, and I still believe the random effects logistic regression model is the recommended tool when you're dealing with hierarchy data and also data that is clustered. So I think it was sufficient enough for that. But at the health facility, we did not do cluster sampling.
At health facility, you did not.
No.
How many health facilities did you recruit in your study?
4.
4. So you assumed that observations among under 5 children in one facility are the same as those other children in another facility. You did not make any assumptions about, for instance, the characteristics of the caregivers affecting antibiotic use, and those caregivers being different from one facility to the other at all.
We try to analyze for that data. However, what we found out was that there was no association between the characteristics of the caregivers, the different hospitals, and the outcome.
Yeah, could that be because you did not account for the potential clustering in your analysis? The whole point of accounting for clustering is to be able to increase the precision of your findings, which, as you mentioned, you tried to do using the analytical technique. But then if you did not, because we know that a healthcare facility will have, for instance, one prescriber, they'll have similar challenges as far as access to antibiotics are concerned, and they'll probably have as a community that informs what antibiotics are given or not. And those factors may be different from another health facility. So in other words, the reason why you may want to revisit and see whether accounting for clustering in your analysis is important is because we cannot assume until we actually do the multi-level analysis or the generalized mixed effects regression. But we'll stop the discussion here, and I will then ask one question. So for purposes of surveillance of antimicrobial consumption and use to determine exposure, what message do you have, for instance, for individuals who operate at national level, are trying to understand what antibiotics are being used where? What message, if you assume there was that kind of person, what message would you have for me from your study? 1 or 2 key messages as far as surveillance of antimicrobials in the community is concerned, or the methods that are currently being used.
Of course, the information I would have for them is that antibiotics are being used. There is over a high prevalence of antibiotic use in children under 5, And also tell them to try and enforce the prescription use of antibiotics, since most people are self-medicating themselves with these antibiotics. And also try to tell them to look for ways of sensitizing the community and training health workers, probably through in-service training.
Yes, and I think the other thing is the fact that the current estimates based on self-reports underestimate the exposure in households, and therefore the need to look at those estimates more closely and hopefully encourage researchers to validate them using some of the approaches you propose. Thank you very much, Dr. Hindum. Good luck, and thank you, the chair and the panel. Over to you. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Kitutu. Please stay online because we shall have a discussion later and we need your input. I am opening the discussion to the public. I only take.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, please.
sorry to interrupt.
Yes, please.
From the discussions that we have had, something brief. I wanted to ask the candidate, are there any intellectual property matters we need to consider regarding the developed method in sub-study 2? It is as if you don't want to reveal the information regarding that method. You don't have the information. Are there any intellectual property issues that you are considering? I'm just throwing this so that it is clear from this defense.
Yes. Thank you very much, opponent. We are going to have 2 questions from the public, one online and one here. Dr. Bosa, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Hindum. Go through this hard process. However, I have just 2 comments. One, you can tell us the difference between an antibiotic and an antibacterial. I don't know whether they are the same. Then the drug and the medicine, there are differences. Then you didn't define what an antibacterial use is, because it would have informed you the way to go. Then my last one, the bias, you didn't deal with the issue of bias. Bias at design, bias at the data collection, and then bias during the data analysis. All those, and the Professor asking about these women in the rural areas, level of education. They are thought that actually from there, we would have even done sub-analysis on that to find out exactly what happens at that level. Then finally, how did this one, your work, play into one health concept?
Thank you very much, Dr. Bosa. Do you want to respond to some of them? Some were your comments, others were questions, actually.
Yes, in this thesis here, we used antibiotics and antibacterial synonymously. However, the difference between antibacterial and antibiotics is that antibiotics are from natural sources. So they can either be antibacterial, they can be antifungal, so long as they're bought from natural sources. Whereas antibacterial are medicines used to treat a bacterial infection or prevent it. And they can either be from natural sources, where the antibiotics, or the synthetic. Then medicine and drug, we do not want to use the word drug really, because according to guidance, I was told drug is usually used mostly for drug of abuse. So that's why you've been seeing I've been using the word antibacterial medicine and not antibacterial drug. Then we define antibacterial use. When you look at my operational definition, antibacterial use is the use of antibacterials to treat or prevent bacterial infection. Yeah, then the level of education, okay, we got it, but in the analysis, as we saw, we reported on it, but in the analysis, most of them had no education, majority of the caregivers. And we reported that as in our discussion as the literacy level of the caregivers being low, which would have also contributed to the results.
Thank you very much. I will take one question from the online colleagues. Anybody wants to ask a question online? Is there any other one present here who wants to ask a question? Public? Okay. There being no other questions, I want to thank my panelists for the exhaustive interaction with the student. I'm sure it's going to improve the final product, Thank you very much. We are now going to ask the public to exit, both online and those present here. Then the panel will stay with the supervisors, or others should stay. Then we discuss whether the candidate has passed or not passed. IT, please disconnect everybody online apart from Freddy Kitu.
Professor, just stay behind.
Yeah, the candidate will come back later. We can come back. And I didn't want to I gave you time.
Very important. They are very important. In a rich place.
We need her to have a good quality book.
That's all the public we have. Where are the others? Is it lunchtime? People have run away.
They've gone away.
Okay, that's fine. Welcome back, candidate. Welcome back, the public. The panel has deliberated over the candidates' presentation. We looked at candidate. We scored you in about 3 or 4 aspects. First was your general knowledge of the subject that you worked on. Then secondly, we looked at your presentation skills. And finally, we looked at, before final, we looked at the quality of the thesis. Was there a PhD in it? We were looking for the PhD in the thesis. Then we also looked at how you responded to the questions when people are asking you. And the panel is satisfied that both the thesis and the candidate are actually PhD material. And I'm happy to inform you that you have passed. So I take the pleasure of calling you Dr. Hindum Lanyero. Okay, congratulations. I think with that, we come to the end of this.
Thank you.
Purpose. Thank you very much. The corrections will be overseen by Cidia.
Where are you based?
Thank you. Oh,
Yes.
thank you very much. We are really happy that you came. I was embarrassed. I was with Dr. Bazila.
Samaria.
Yeah, we
Still here.
set up a microbiological